Student protest rallies in the Canadian province of Quebec show no sign of easing despite the police crackdown. The protesters poured into the streets again in Montreal on Sunday to slam the government plans to raise university fees just a day before police arrested at least 28 protesters in the city. Protest leaders say they'll continue their rallies. Nearly 170,000 students have been refusing to attend class since mid-February, and the protesters are spreading as other groups, including anti-capitalists and labor unions, are joining in. Well, for more on the Canada protests, we're joined by Joshua Blakeney, Press TV's correspondent from Calgary. Joshua, what's the latest that you have to share with us from the student protests and the crackdown that they've been facing?
Yes, well, the student protests are bourgeoning throughout Canada, not only in the major cities of Calgary and Toronto and, of course, Montreal, but in more peripheral cities. For example, this weekend in the provincial capital of the province of British Columbia, Victoria, British Columbia, there was a quite important student protest. So throughout Canada, there is an uprising against the draconian austerity measures that are being imposed upon them, both by provincial governments and by the federal government, led by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Of course, it has to be kept in mind that in the last 12 months, it has been revealed that the election in 2011, which installed Canada's neoliberal government, was a fraudulent election, and so many Canadians are viewing their political figures as being illegitimate and unelected, lacking a democratic mandate. And so within the context of Quebec, which I would say is the most politically engaged province in Canada, we're seeing mass resistance to politicians who are viewed as unbelievable, as undemocratic, indeed anti-democratic. And it was quite symbolic that this weekend we had the Formula One Grand Prix descend upon Montreal. Of course, the Grand Prix incurred controversy when it decided to go to Bahrain, where there was brutal repression being visited upon the people of Bahrain by the Arab potentate there. And of course, many Quebecois will be looking at their own leaders and drawing comparisons with some of the more anti-democratic elements in the Middle East and their own leaders, who they would view as merely being stooges or puppets of the US and Israel, and of course the capitalists who stand behind them. People in Quebec care a great deal about sovereignty. There was a great movement in the 1960s and 70s that still persists to this day for Quebec to have independence, because it has a unique cultural situation with its French heritage. And the people of Quebec care about their sovereignty a great deal, and they don't like it when they see their elected officials serving a kind of transnational capitalist class, which is the bigger picture here. Students would say, well, Canada has an abundance of resources, indeed a veritable cornucopia of water, gas, oil, diamonds. Why can't that wealth percolate down to the students and to the working class? And the students in Quebec have often aspired towards a kind of Scandinavian-style social democracy with some success, which is why we see such a highly engaged, highly educated populace in that province, because they are the product of their parents' generation's struggle for a fair system. And so the students are looking at the resources in Canada, they're looking at the decisions, the economic decisions of their political leaders, and they're displeased, and they're expressing that despite the attempts of the political class to enshrine draconian legislation such as Bill 78, which proscribes peaceful gatherings, proscribes freedom of expression, makes it in a way where the student body almost has to come and plead with the police in order to have a protest. They're looking at the Canadian Constitution, which was enshrined in 1982, which defends every person in Canada's right to have freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And they're claiming that the laws that the politicians are enshrining, the kind of bylaws to prevent protest, are themselves illegal. And so those politicians who are speaking in such a bellicose way about law and order are viewed themselves as the lawless ones by those students who are merely enjoying their right, which is mandated by the supreme law of Canada in the Canadian Constitution, for freedom of assembly and freedom of speech.
Right. Joshua Blakeney, many thanks. Press TV's correspondent from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Moving on, first the Élysée Palace, and now heading for control of the Parliament. French President François Hollande's socialists are within an inch of an absolute parliamentary majority.